So yeah, I mean, I guess I want to give you a bit of a disclaimer, perhaps. Is I'm one person. I'm one person that talks about the experiences of exclusion and ways to enhance and promote greater inclusion. But I feel like I have learned so much of what I'm going to share with you from others. And so I do want to acknowledge that. Um, I'm an expert of my own experience, but I don't want to suggest that I'm an expert of others. So, um, to just give the context for that.
We appreciate that, Fran, for sure. And we're going to get started. I'll get started with asking the first question. So, what are the barriers people with disabilities experience in workplaces?
I think there's lots, and I think that given we only have an hour, maybe I'll just sort of go over a few. But I'm sure that most folks can appreciate that this idea of accessibility is probably the biggest challenge. And when I say accessibility, it means accessibility beyond just a ramp or beyond just an automatic door opener. I think it's really about what kind of infrastructure an organization has to be able to provide technology that is adaptable, that is going to allow people with screen readers to have alternative format material on the website, um, as well as being able to access information, as well as being able to give information in a way that's going to work for the person with the disability themselves. So, an example might be, someone who might have print related disabilities. That could be somebody who's blind, low vision, may also be somebody with a learning disability, might also be somebody who processes information differently. And so when we are reliant only on communicating through text, we really are creating a barrier for so many people, especially if that requirement to communicate back is also in the same format. So, thinking about how can we make our workplace more accessible that moves us beyond just using print as the only way for us to communicate. Um, I'm also thinking of another example. The years that I worked in community, I did work with a number of different communities, and one of those was the deaf community. And I remember, working in an organization that would typically be considered a hearing organization. And it took us many tries to really appreciate that the barrier that our deaf staff were experiencing were really us. We're really around the fact that we were reliant on American Sign Language to be the only way that we could communicate. And so when we were thinking about having meetings with deaf staff, um, those meetings would only be arranged maybe every 2 weeks. But we didn't have a staff that was a dedicated interpreter. And so that deaf staff person oftentimes was isolated in an organization that was really working very hard to break down barriers, but experience barriers in our own organization. And it can feel very isolating for a staff person with a disability who's only seen as having accommodation, and efforts are minimal to actually provide those accommodations, more than just within a meeting or a staff meeting. But to be able to have someone on site for that staff person to be able to access. How many of you get information when you're just chit chatting at the coffee pot, grabbing yourself a coffee, maybe, heading for lunch, and that's where you get to connect. But if the only time you get to connect is in a staff meeting, because accommodation's been provided, it can make it really isolating for a deaf person. I think another barrier has to relate to the lack of accommodations and the lack of consistent accommodation procedures in organizations. I think many times managers think that accommodation is expensive and that it is also reflective of people's biases around who deserves, and I use air quote, accommodation. Um, and so as a result, we don't really make that an active part of the conversation when we are onboarding or even when we're thinking about hiring disabled people for future positions. So it often results in the person with the disability having to advocate for themselves at the risk of now outing themselves around their disability experience, which might be quite traumatic, which might be, really a place of concern if they're going into an organization that doesn't know very much about disability or carries with it um, biases that are see disabled people as less than. And so even recruitment, are we using recruitment strategies that are reflective of who's in the workforce? Is it only that temporarily non-disabled people can do that job? Or is there a way that we can look at work requirements to actually make them more accessible and flexible, recognizing that not everyone doesn't have a disability, isn't going to somehow, at some point in their life, maybe acquire one? And does that mean then that they will no longer be able to do that job? So again, thinking about present and also the future. Um, Even onboarding, I think we have a consistent checklist around onboarding in many organizations. And is that checklist something that can be modified and made more flexible depending on the person that's coming in? The rate of unemployment or underemployment for people with disabilities is quite significant. So we want to work, but we just don't have the opportunities to work. And when we are in a work situation, our experience of retention is also a struggle because we may be in a situation where we are now having to disclose that we will need an accommodation and then experience some pushback from manager or our team leader. And so then what? Right? Then that makes it very difficult to really bring your whole self to the workplace. So that's just, I think there's some, I think this idea of glass ceiling started when we were looking at, folks that were female identified in the workplace. Glass ceilings are existing for lots of communities, and that would include disabled people as well.
Great. Fran, you've already shared so much insight in this opening question. So in terms of recruitment, what are the barriers in the recruitment process, onboarding, retention, and supporting persons in the workplace? I really like your suggestion, or you talked about someone who is deaf working in a hearing organization, and really how there should be colleagues who learn ASL to ensure that that person can fully participate. So that's a learning for me. That's something I'll take away with.
Yeah, and I think we need to take the expectation off the plate of that it has to be perfect. I think that if we don't try, then we don't know. And I think many um, employees who are deaf that want to work, want to go into a setting where they see their hearing coworkers making a meaningful effort. And that means learning a little bit of ASL. Hello, how are you? So that you're not only communicating when that interpreter comes in a couple of hours from now. And I think that was a huge learning for us in our organization.
Such a like you said, a huge learning, but such a great opportunity, right? To really practice. As you said, it was an organization working to end exclusion and barriers, but how do you practice that internally as well?
Yeah, and I think it was, recognizing that we too are works in progress and that we have opportunities as a hearing organization, as allies, to also learn.
And it's an ongoing process, right? Yeah, I think we'll get into that a little bit later. All right. So, and if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll get to them as well. But the next question I have is, what is at the root of the oppression that persons with disabilities experience?
I think the root of people's experience of oppression is centered around ableism. And ableism is, there's lots of definitions out there, but I think this one is really, to the point, and it's by Ashley Eisenmeyer, who is with Access Living in Chicago. And she writes that ableism is the discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief about that typical abilities are superior. So that we all want to be non-disabled, that we all want to be hearing, that we all want to have and move through the world with this typical idea of mental health and well-being. And that isn't all of our experiences. And so when I think about disability oppression, at the center of that is seeing people with disabilities as needing to be fixed, as objects of pity, that our lives are tragic, are not quite as whole as others, and diverse. And I think that similar to experiences around racism, heterosexism, and class, for example, ableism is really another way of classifying entire groups of people based on this idea of less than, and often seeing disabled people as less than human in many circumstances. And these are all fed by white supremacist ideology and capitalism. What does it mean to be a good worker? Ideas of productivity. And at the center of that is, the discourses around colonialism. And how are we challenging that in our own workplace? So, I think this, an example of ableism is not having captioning on video conferencing. You might ask for it, but what if you just automatically put it on? People can turn it off, but if they have to ask for it, it then means that they're outing themselves. And what if we could be proactive? What if we could also think about hiring policies, but also sick time policies when people have days that they're just not well? And it may not necessarily be something that they go to a doctor about. I'm thinking about people's experiences around mental health and well-being, and that we can't honor that people might just need to, take care of themselves, particularly in the context of capitalism, is we want to keep pushing people beyond their capacity. And I think, the other thing that is ableist in nature is this idea of performance ratings or evaluation. And I know I'm probably, opening up a kettle of worms on that one, but I do think that performance evaluations also perpetuate what it means to be a good worker, what it means to achieve and be successful, and how that can actually harm both folks with disabilities, but I want to offer also non disabled people too, who internalize their own beliefs about what their bodies and minds should be able to do. And when they can't perform or achieve that level, then somehow they have failed or are a failure. And I think that gets, replicated in the kind of evaluations that currently exist and how we determine success in the workplace. So that's kind of it, I think. Yeah, I think we don't talk about ableism for non-disabled people. I think we only think that it's folks with disabilities that experience it. And I want to say that I think clearly there's a dynamic that exists when you come to see your own body as having to measure up. And when you cannot perform or cannot bring your whole self, then that is when we start to feel shame and guilt about asking for support.
Really, uncovered or surfaced a number of different issues, right? And so acknowledging that the root of this oppression lies in white supremacy and capitalism, I think that's something we often miss. But the notion of perfectionism, um, primacy of the written word, that productivity and that hustle culture and mentality, that's making us very sick, but yet we hang on to it. Those are really rooted in those systems of oppression. So thank you for teasing that out and making those connections more obvious for
It's
us.
hard to let go,
Yeah, yeah.
right? It's hard to let go because it means we have to think about something different. And I want to offer that I think absolutely something different can be possible if we're willing to make that commitment.
Mm. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that something different could be?
I think that something different is really thinking about not just about disability rights, but also thinking about disability justice. And I don't mean justice in the context of disability rights, but really this framework that exists around recognizing that historically um, the fight for rights has tended to be done by white um, male identified folks, typically with physical disabilities, who were believed to be at the forefront of the disability rights movement, when really there were so many more people in the background that were making the difference. And so when we think about disability rights, I think it's also really important to think that only a few people will actually be able to be privileged enough to be able to have access to those rights. Not everyone will be able to have those rights. Similarly, other human rights, um, not everyone can enjoy them in the same way, even though they are in our legislation. And so I think when we think about disability justice, it really is a shifting away from seeing disabled people as sort of this monolithic group and recognizing that people with disabilities are part of marginalized communities that are often not at the table. So I don't know if many people know about disability justice as a framework, but it was started in the US, I would say probably maybe 10, 15 years ago by a small group of BIPOC, queer, and trans folks with disabilities who were doing activist work around anti-Black racism and the rights around LGBT folks. But they were also recognizing that there weren't other disabled people doing this work, that it was really a siloed experience. And so Patty Byrne and Stacey Milburn and Mia Mingus are sort of the forerunners of this work and recognize that Black, Indigenous people of color need to be at the table. They need to be at the table around disability because of the intersections around race, disability, and recognizing that intersectionality, even within our own community, is not often recognized enough in being able to make the work and inclusion being as meaningful as it possibly can. So a little bit of a history thing, but I mean, I think that within disability justice, there are these principles around really pushing back around capitalism, really recognizing people's wholeness, even their messiness, right? We are all messy, folks. Hate to tell you, and I don't mean that just for disabled people, just as human beings. And recognizing that the leadership needs to come from those that are most impacted. And when we can really think about liberation, it means that we're not leaving anyone behind. And that my access doesn't trump yours. It's more about collective access. And so when we think about accessibility, I think oftentimes we think about the narrative being solely centered around folks with disabilities. And I want to say that access can benefit everybody. Whether you've identified that as an issue in your life, when you can come into a place where you don't have to feel like you're navigating barriers that may not be so obvious for others, it can make a huge difference in being able to be there fully.
That's great. I see there's a question in the chat, so maybe we can take that one now from Chanel. Thanks so much, Chanel. So, Fran, do you have examples of performance evaluation processes that prioritize well-being and or a different definition of productivity?
I don't. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think we are still working through that. And I think that I'm not a lawyer, folks. So I just want to be very clear that I'm going to say something that is probably moves into sort of legal obligations. But I want us to really think about, even in the construction of performance, and even in the construction of accommodation, we have at the core this belief that people must prove themselves in order to get the support that they need. It also means when we think about performance, we're also thinking about performance of that person who's doing the job. And are we setting up performance reviews that really don't promote success, that are really defined by the funder, who may not, who may also, have their own parameters around what it means to have program outcomes. But those program outcomes in this time that we're in may not necessarily be realistic. And how do we ensure success for the program but also for the folks that are running it. And I think that's still more of a conversation. But what I wanted to say around accommodation is I think that we have a system right now where we ask people to, we don't trust people enough to know what they need. We ask people to give documentation from a doctor that they need X, Y, and Z, when really I know absolutely what I need. My doctor doesn't come to work with me. My doctor sees me for like 15 minutes and maybe knows me a little bit. But I think when we have these kinds of accommodation policies where we require the professional expertise of someone outside of the individual who's asking for it, we are really saying we don't trust you. We don't trust you and that you know what you need. And I'm probably, diving in the middle of the pool without my little floaty wings. I know that. But I really do feel strongly about this. I have, worked in settings for many, many years and still have to be asked to complete an accommodation request. When my access hadn't changed from 2 years ago, I still need these things. Or for folks who have, disabilities that do change, don't rely on that old document because it's not reflective of the fact that disability is not static.
Thanks so much, Fran. And I know in terms of performance evaluations, they're either like really good and you right at work or they're really bad. So like the last place I worked, they were really bad. Like I did not get anything constructive. I just like, they were like 5 to 10 minutes long. I'm like, this is just a complete waste of time. So, I'm sitting here thinking how to do that better in a way that is more helpful and is not harmful. So,
Well, I
like how do, yeah, so
I,
that's
I have also been through that experience,
great.
and I think, folks, the challenge is there's no room to say I wasn't able to do this, right? Like, well, why weren't you able to?
Mhm, mhm.
Oh, well, maybe I didn't have the supports to be able to do this. There's a fear about not being successful in every point that's being reviewed. And when you are able to say, look, this isn't why I wasn't able to meet this goal. It's not because I wasn't interested or I wasn't trying, but I didn't have the supports in order for me to be able to do that in a way that was going to allow me to be here fully.
Goes back to a lot that trust factor that's often missing in work relationships, that people aren't feeling right that they can trust to share that. Yeah, I wasn't able to do that because I didn't have the support or I wasn't, um, to admit that the gaps or admission. So and that's often because there's not that trust, right? Because you feel you're going to get fired or something, right?
Yeah, and I'm really mindful when I say I couldn't do that,
Mm.
it's not because of the disability. I think it's really important that we don't frame the challenge because of disability. And I think oftentimes that's how it gets framed.
So I
I
see someone has their hand up. So why don't we take this question if that's all right with you, Fran?
Sure.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you everyone. This is amazing. Got the invite last minute, so really appreciate all the sharing here. My name is Javel Velasquez. I'm with the BC Public Service, and I just wanted to mention that in our workplace, we've gravitated towards more formal, structured performance reviews, like what we've been talking about. I think it's a good step in the right direction, which are performance conversations. performance development that are to be held within the quarter. They're all not all due at the same time. We're given templates on how to have that conversation, whether it's onboarding or whether there are some issues that need to be discussed, or whether it's just a check-in. Hey, we haven't sat down and spoken about how we're doing in a long time. So I like that we've kind of gravitated towards that direction. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I really, yeah. Thank you. I like that idea as opposed to what can often feel like a goal, right? You haven't met your goal, as opposed to what if we have check-ins throughout the year to see how you're managing or how things are going in meeting that outcome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Super helpful. Because it moves from being punitive, which often, right, evaluations feel like, to being, yeah, let's have a conversation. Let's see how we can better support you and set you up for success. It should be the ultimate outcome, right? Okay. So let's go to the next question, Fran. What should employers do to better support employees with disabilities?
Sorry, what should employers? I think there's a lot of things. One is, here's the thing, folks. Ask the person. Before we, sort of unpack all of these other areas, I really think if we are wanting to promote the belief that people know what they need, then ask them, how can I support you in the work that you're doing? I also think this is a question to ask everyone, not just the person with the disability, because you actually don't know who is in your workplace that might have a disability, because there's a range of invisible disabilities and people may not have disclosed for fear of being outed, or for fear of suddenly being questioned. Well, you didn't need that last week and now you need it this week, right? There can be a real sort of challenge in that. I think other ways that employers can support employees with disabilities is thinking about having inclusive interviews. So, having interview questions that's in front of that person, right? Instead of kind of being the person that holds on to those questions. And really, it can be huge to be able to look at the question, mull it over in your mind, because we're all nervous, right? We're nervous. We don't always, always think in the typical ways that we might think when we're not nervous and feeling under pressure. And so I would just offer, having the questions in a format that works for the individual. You may also think about, sending out the questions in advance. Wow, wouldn't that be amazing if somebody could actually come somewhat prepared? Maybe it's not all the questions, but it should be. But, even the ones that are ones that someone can come in prepared, and then you might ask other kinds of questions in that interview after they've answered it. Another consideration is benefits packages. For lots of folks with disabilities, one, we're lucky if we get work. Two, oftentimes our work is precarious and that we might be underemployed. And so we may not have access to a benefits package. And so for many individuals who might be on, say, for example, ODSP, wanting to go back to work or wanting to, work for the first time, there may be concessions that they will have to let go of their benefits, still to stay on ODSP, but may not be able to carry through on their benefits. And so people might have medications that they can't continue to get if they do try to work. And so sometimes the system sets it up very much for us not to want to work, because the benefits that come, as meager as they are, can also be quite life sustaining. And so thinking about an employee package that has counseling, that has counselors that know about ableism and other forms of oppression, where counselors aren't thinking about the disability as a problem or the person with the disability as being a problem. So again, thinking about, good benefits packages, even for folks that are part-time. I know I'm so radical, but I think this is, really recognizing the contributions that people do make in whatever capacity they're able to come into that organization. I also think it's important to have a budget that will provide for accommodation. Many of us here, it's too expensive, or we can't purchase that. Where if we actually, create and are proactive in coming up with a budget that would allow for there to be accommodations provided, then it feels less onerous for the employee with the disability to sort of have to manage the number of requests that they might need to make. And I also think, mentorship. I think lots of us don't get opportunities to be mentored because we may not be in those positions yet at a sort of upper management, or thinking that we are even management material to be, mentored. And I think that's also a huge gap that we don't get to experience as others might. And so, yeah, really, really thinking about leadership and capacity and what people do bring, rather than, seeing that person as always having to stay in the low skilled, low paying positions that I know many marginalized communities encounter when trying to find work. So that's just a little bit. Oh, one more thing, folks. Talk about disability. It's not a bad thing. Really, it's okay. We don't need to make disability a bad thing, or it's about normalizing the experience so that people can share themselves if they choose to, but also know that if they do, there isn't going to be this resistance or this disbelief that can come up when someone suddenly discloses. I don't know if that's helpful, but
that is super, super helpful. Such practical tips. Very practical. Talking about disability, like just let's have conversations, right? Providing access in ways that mentorship opportunities, of course, right? Allowing those people who want to aspire to management leadership positions getting that mentorship. So again, very easy things to implement. So thank you for sharing those, what I would say are very practical and doable. So the next question, Fran, if someone's needs are not being accommodated at work, what actions can they take?
well, I mean, I think one is to, talk to HR, find out what are the policies around accommodation and access. But I also, not all HR folks are fluent in disability. And so may not know what legislation under the human rights or the employment standards requirements are for a for an organization working with employees with disabilities. I think also if that isn't an option or is causing more frustration, is your business unionized? Is there someone that's part of your union that is a rep that you can reach out to? Again, I think, the union are not always disability friendly. It has been historically the experience for many of us, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a desire to be. And I think that more and more folks are really recognizing that if you are lucky enough to grow old, you're going to experience disability. You are going to have an aging workforce, whether that's new employees or existing. So how do we catch up so that people aren't feeling that they are having to leave because of bodies and minds that, are changing? And I also have heard that there's, and I'm sorry, I'm not remembering. There is an organization that does work around workers' rights, and that is another place that folks can go to if they're not feeling satisfied with what's happening internally.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Fran. So Mateus dropped a question in the chat. So, hi, Fran. Can you elaborate more on a better way to frame communicating a difficulty in completing a task with a supervisor or even a team member?
I'm going to share this example, and I don't mean to equate it with the question that you're asking, but I think it's a really practical idea. And that is, I do a lot of work with shelters. And shelters, even though folks are really trying to work from an anti-oppression perspective, that sometimes because of the kind of environment that people are working within, they don't have the time to really work with someone who might learn differently, who might need more support around understanding the task. And so I think that when we create tools that can be used by everybody, then we're not centering someone out because they might process information around the request or the communication related to a task. And I think having a conversation that isn't feeling punitive or evaluative, that, what can I do as your supervisor, as your coworker, to support you in being able to complete this task? Is there something that I'm not doing to communicate the things that you need to be doing? Again, I think we often frame the problem on the individual rather than framing the fact that we all have different communication styles and they don't always match, and so how do we create opportunities for the conversation rather than the evaluation? I don't know if that answers, Mateus, your question, but hopefully it does. It really does come from us, folks. Got to tell you, it has to come with our willingness to think outside the box.
And again, creating space for those conversations, and not always the evaluation and the punishment. Really, just reframing work, right?
Yeah, yeah. Reframing work. If you are somebody who has multiple responsibilities, um, like, okay, so maybe one day you do work at home, right? Some of us actually get more work done at home when we're not worrying about our aging parents or we're not worrying about our children and, or feeling like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen if my child is sick and I don't have support, right? Just, I think that flexibility and the hybrid is really important to make it more accessible and inclusive for everyone.
It is. I see you raised your hand. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks for trying to answer that question, Fran. I know it was a little challenging. Um, Reason why I'm asking actually is just some context behind this is I have a friend who's living with a disability, right? He's wheelchair bound. And so he's had he managed to get a employment situation virtually for some period of time. And then because of the needs that he has, there's certain points where he gets pain and he can't do anything, right? He needs to stop, take a break. Um, he has to, he has no choice. And he tried communicating this with his employer, and like because he was within the 90 days probationary period, they were like, this is not something that you're able to do. This is a challenge. Like you need to get the work done pretty much. And like that's how it ended up happening. So he tried to communicate about his needs, and so unfortunately, like that didn't pan out. He's no longer with that employer, right? But like that's why I'm asking, like, how do you frame that as not being a challenge in terms of like, oh, and forgive me for not framing the wording correctly
Of
if I
course.
don't, but like I'm experiencing pain, I'm in a wheelchair, I can't do that. But instead of like saying, oh, I'm experiencing pain, that's the issue. Like I don't know if it's different language, right? I don't know if that's what you were trying to really
I,
highlight there. But
yeah, I,
yeah.
hmm. So I think uh, there's a resistance, I think, on the part of the employer to really think around flexibility. Um, I think if someone had an injury, if they came into the workplace as somebody who is temporarily able-bodied and sustained an injury and are trying to go back into work, maybe that injury is causing um, like moments of pain. Would there be more um, compassion or empathy for that person? Or is there something else? I think there's something else, quite honestly, going on that is around ableism. Absolutely. This is a way that potentially can get that person out of the workplace because legally, I would think that's probably a human rights violation. Yeah. And I do think, um, again, the human rights legislation is there to support, but it's also a very long process. And it doesn't work for everyone. But the highest number of complaints that the Human Rights Commission is receiving is from folks with disabilities who are encountering very similar responses. And think about it in the probation period, right? This is also a challenge, right? You better perform till you get beyond that, probation period. And then you can, disclose what you need. And I think that's just so unfair and is not equitable employment practices. So I may never be asked to do this again, Matthias, but here we go. And can I offer just like a little moment around language? So wheelchair bound, that might actually be another workshop, and that might be, around other things than disability. I'm trying to make a joke, but we don't use wheelchair bound. Actually, our wheelchairs are a freedom. So I don't feel bound to my chair. I feel that my chair allows me to live my life, allows me to go out into the world. And again, I don't know how your friend, sees their experience, but that is also about allyship, is recognizing our own language that can sometimes be harmful. Is that sound fair? Yeah? I'm not always so great at doing this, but maybe instead of a wheelchair bound, wheelchair user.
Okay, that works. Thank you.
Yeah? Okay, great.
That's great. No, important question. And it's unfortunate that people with disabilities and persons from other equity deserving communities, we always have to be advocating for ourselves in workplaces and other spaces to have our rights respected. So I'm sorry to hear, Matthias, that your friend is experiencing this. And I see we're right at the top of the hour. I can't believe the hour has gone by this fast. But in 2 minutes, Fran, can you share where some persons can learn more about accessibility and disability justice?
Yeah, I mean, for folks that are in Ontario, there is, so the Center for Independent Living in Toronto does a lot of work with organizations around having an understanding around disability justice and inclusion. And they have speakers that will go out and do this work. So that's here in Toronto. There is also the Disability Justice Network of Ontario that does a lot of activist work and education around the principles of disability justice and really recognizing opportunities for greater allyship in, promoting inclusion that is for everybody. And both of those organizations have websites that you can access.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Fran. Today it feels like we just scratched the surface. There's so much more to talk about, so much more we can dig into. But of course, we're limited by the time. I want to thank you again, Fran, for agreeing to be a guest speaker today, sharing your insight, your wisdom with us. Everyone who showed up, I hope that you spending this hour of your time has been helpful. I hope you learned something new. And yeah, we'll send a follow-up email with some resources, some other information, or where you can find Fran and connect with Fran as well. So look out for that email later this week. Thank you all so much. We'll have future webinars. Our next session will be looking at DEI and leadership. So what is that important role that leaders need to play in businesses and organizations? So we'll email you that information as well. So thank you again for being here today. Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for asking great questions.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thanks for
Michelle,
joining.
thank you. Awesome to see Chris. Yeah. Oh my gosh. All right. Anyway, so good to see everyone. Michelle, thank you.
I'll text you.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
All right.
Nice to meet you, Michelle.
Nice to meet you, Chris, and thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate
Yeah,
it.
it was great. Great workshop.
Awesome. Awesome.